So Christine invited me to talk with Professor Keila Grinberg about this book. It is A Black Jurist in a Slave Society, Antonio Pereira, Rebouças, and the Trials of Brazilian Citizenship. The book is both about Antonio Pereira Rebouças and not about him. And by that I mean it's not a biographical account of his life, step by step through his life. Instead, it's closer to a microhistory that follows the political and legal trajectory of Antonio Pereira Rebouças, best known as André Rebouças' father prior to this, to learn more about 19th century Brazil. Rebouças was a staunch liberal, champion of individual rights, fighter for Brazilian independence, self-trained lawyer and statesman, born to a white Portuguese father and a free Black mother in Bahia. We learn from Keila's book that Rebouças believed in citizenship and civil rights for all free people, upheld the right to and social worth drawn from having private property, and dedicated himself to legal reform in lieu of rebellion or revolution. Rebouças defended the rights of free people, but respected the enslaved as possessions and defended the right to private property above all else. Keila's book shows that he's an exception and that he is a self-taught mulatto lawyer who takes on official governmental roles and becomes a successful appeals court lawyer. And yet he's also typical, and that he isn't necessarily a champion of the people, but yet another person climbing up the social hierarchy that he helps to uphold. Grinberg's book is at times a social history, at times a legal history, at times a political history, and at others an intellectual history. We learn from the almost unthinkable figure of Rebouças how to resolve what might seem to be contradictions in Brazilian thought in the 19th century. We learn about how liberalism and slavery could exist in the same arguments and in the same spaces, how social mobility could exist within entrenched and active racism, and how an individual can separate themselves from a social phenomenon, individualizing discriminatory affronts. We also learn about local rebellions, the place of local politics in global revolutions, the circulation of ideas within communities around the world, surprising arguments for ending the slave trade, the codification of the legal code, and everyday forms of racism, resistance, compliance, and mobility. We come to see little by little that while Rebouças' position seemed impossible to us at the beginning of the book, many of his ideas and positions fit perfectly within his temporal and geographic context. It is really a beautifully written and translated book, and it was a joy to read. And so I'm very happy to be here and to discuss this book with Professor Grinberg, or with Keila, I will call you. But I'll start with a really open general question to get us started. Could you situate this book a bit within your trajectory as a historian, and what brought you to Rebouças as a subject?
Well, first of all, thank you, Christina, and thanks, Courtney, for inviting me. It's very, very, it's wonderful to be able to talk about my, by that book. And also to be able to discuss with new people, about those ideas that seem now to be telling a lot about contemporary, not just Brazil, but contemporary Americas. So, thanks, it's great to be here. The way I got, it's interesting that you started asking me that. The way I got to Rebouças was through a series of methodological mistakes. And I think that some people might find this useful. My first work was about a set of freedom lawsuits, which I don't know if all of you know what they are about. It's the lawsuits when enslaved individuals sue their masters, arguing they have the right to be free over the whole 19th century. And I wrote the book about the specific case of Liberata, but it's really a discussion about the sources and what we could do with those freedom lawsuits. And this was before I started my my graduate program. So when I started, I had this idea that I was going to find all the abolitionist lawyers that defended the enslaved individuals in court. So I read again all those 400 lawsuits, and I had a database of all lawyers that would defend enslaved, that would defend masters. And I had this image in my mind. Okay, I will get the databases, I'll put this to work, and then I'll have a list of the good ones and the bad ones. The ones who would defend, that would be abolitionists in, let's say, 1860s on, and the others who would defend the masters. But now, as you can imagine, that this went all wrong, because when I had my list, and the final list is the one that I analyzed at the third part of the book, with 26 lawyers, they were pretty much all of them, except for one abolitionist, Caetano Alberto Soares. They were all lawyers, and they were doing what you would expect from a lawyer. So then when this whole plan ruined, I thought about studying the Instituto of the Advogados Brasileiros, the main institution for, I don't know how you say that, the main institutional bar, something. And then I found Rebouças, which was really my advisor then, Professor Abby Matos, who pointed out to him. When I saw his name, the only thing that I knew about him was that he could be, and then I found out he was the father of André Rebouças. And I think that André Rebouças, this is the topic of another discussion, but André Rebouças is probably one of it's not just an important abolitionist, he's a very important thinker of Brazil in the late 19th century. And just, having this figure of a self-made man who was the father of those two engineers just made me go to him. But I like to tell the story of the mistake, because when we are actually, and I think that you all have been through that, when we are in the middle of the research and you find a street that goes nowhere, you think, what I'm gonna do now? And it's interesting to rethink your question. And then other questions came in, questions that I didn't, issues that were not in my mind, such as race. Before I was just thinking about slavery and the law. And when I got closer to Rebouças, I started thinking about slavery, race, and the law. And I think that made a big difference.
Yeah, I liked, there's a point in the book where you mention that that once you started paying attention, you noticed Rebouças everywhere. That everywhere you turned, you saw him here, and there, and you'd never noticed it before. And I thought, boy, it must have been difficult actually to stop writing this when that's the case. You know what I mean? That you have to decide, this instance where I found him will be the last one that I'm going to pay attention to. So this is, obviously an important book that has been cited and become, part of the literature on 19th century Brazil, and is so important that it was translated to English and published by the University of North Carolina Press. How do you feel about the impact the book has had, both in, I guess, the Portuguese language literature and in the English language literature? What surprises might there have been within that?
Well, the book in Portuguese was published in 2002. And so it's a long time, and it has been out of print for a long time too. So I think that one of the interesting things that I wasn't thinking then, and now we are more, is that Rebouças is really one of the Black intellectuals of 19th century Brazil. And I had this in mind when I was working in the translation. So that's one of the, I think that here in Portuguese, the book really made part of a historiographical trend that we can call this I don't know if that's right, that's social legal history or social history of the law, which really is part of something that was actually also going on in the US then with Rebecca Scott's works and that kind of thing. So there was really a lot of connection when I was writing. And then the discussion here with other authors such as Silvia Lara, who has been working on that. I think then this was a very important part of the book. Now, the English edition came out in December of 19, and right after that, the pandemic started. So everything that we had planned didn't really happen. But then I got the wonderful surprise to be one of the finalists of the Frederick Douglass Prize, which was really a wonderful surprise for that. Tells, I think, the potential of the book, and also that a translated book can be also a book that can have its own history. So maybe one thing that I should mention is that the book is it's not that it's totally different, but we did work a lot on making it better or more feasible for the English-speaking audience.
Could since we're on that topic, could we talk a bit about, or could you talk a bit about the process of that translation? I think you mentioned in the agradecimentos, in the acknowledgements, about speaking with Kristen McGuire, who's the translator of the book, and sitting down and having conversations about it. Could you talk a bit more about what that process was like? What was it like to turn this book from 2002 into a book from 2019 in another language?
Yeah, that's a very good question. She's a wonderful translator, not a professional translator, and she's a wonderful English writer. So we basically did much together in terms of how we could rewrite the book. So basically, she did a wonderful job of pointing out sentences in Portuguese that didn't make much sense. That now, because that's how you get those things to happen. She's like, I'm not understanding this. What do you want to say? And I was like, yeah, I don't understand it either. Let's rewrite. So we worked together on this for 6 months, and we can say that we worked in every single sentence. And I think that's the result. It's because of her, of how this is readable in the way I think it is. It's because we really rewrote a lot. And I deleted many of the quotations that they seemed very important in 2002, when you just finish your dissertation and you think that the whole world wants to read your quotes, which is actually not true. So 17 years later, I could see that some of those quotes, no one needed to read besides me. And then in this process, there are some things that we shifted. The book became, I think, less of a legal history and more well divided. And maybe there is an attention to the fact that Rebouças, you can tell the history of the concepts of race and the silence about race, and what we would call today the fact that he was someone that would defend slavery but also be anti-racist. So I think those are the points that are highlighted in that version in a better way than they were in the Portuguese edition.
It does read really, really fluidly, and I'm sure that in part I can understand that being in part because you sat down and had to pick through every single sentence and how it was structured and what it did. But I think it also has a lot to do with the ability to kind of zoom into Rebouças and zoom out through the many different scales of between him and the world. And we were talking before everybody came in, for example, about the points about him growing up during these different points of rebellion that are taking place. And I remember wondering, how were you able to keep all of that present in mind in order to write it out and remember, oh yes, at this time that, when he turned 16, this was happening. And it's done really well. You don't lose sight of him, and you don't lose sight of the big picture of the circulation of ideas in the world or even locally. So it really is a beautifully written text, and it's easy to read. And I think particularly the first couple of sections are useful in teaching about the circulation of ideas on race and on slavery and liberal ideas in 19th century Brazil, or just learning about studying 19th century Brazil in general. That brings me to another question. How did you construct that? How were you able to keep in mind the kind of the small picture and the big picture? Do you use timelines? What was your kind of nitty-gritty methodology of holding this all together?
Well, it's a great question, because I guess that at one point I was thinking that this could be a micro history, but then it couldn't, because it was too, it's a story person, and then it goes this way. And what I really wanted wasn't this kind of shifts in focus that when you look at one context or one situation. But what I wanted was something like looking at, if you think this is the path of his life, I wanted something like this, that it could actually come and go in different levels, but following his life. So what I did is I had different timelines. So I had, and I still do that when I'm trying to finish another work, and I'm trying to do the same. I had a very detailed timeline of his life, of Rebouças' life. And then once I had that, I was feeling in different, this was, I'm not going to say that this was pre-computer, because it was not, but it was certainly pre all those apps we have. and pre-notebook, because my notebook was so big then we wouldn't consider a notebook. And I'm saying that because I couldn't carry it to places. So I kept one in my wall, a big timeline in my wall, and I was just filling with different colors, and I was trying not to leave anything out. So I'm really glad that you were saying that about the way it reads, because it was something that I spent a lot of time thinking. What would be the best way to do, to honor how exceptional his life was, but at the same time discussing the main issues of his time. especially until the 1840s.
Yeah, it came across really, really well. And I mean, to the point that, because you'd said in the introduction, this isn't a biography, and my first thought was everybody says that, but it really isn't. It isn't. Like it follows his life. But at the same time, if you lose 6 years of Rebouças' life in this story, you don't feel like it was 6 years lost in a biography. Because you're following something else. You know what I mean? You're following the history of these ideas, or how discussions of property and possession changed over time, or how this fits within some other portion of the story. And I thought it read really, really well. It's a great example of how to do this kind of history, I think, and one that I am glad that I read and can use as a model in my own writing, I hope. Another thing that stood out to me in this book was that we're looking at ideas particular to the 19th century, or that define the 19th century in a way, right? And yet I get the feeling that a lot of these ideas persist in some ways. And I'm thinking, I guess, particularly about for example, talking about prioritizing maintaining social order over enforcing civil rights. Civil rights are great unless they might actually upset the social order. And that felt like something that felt very familiar to me. It felt like a very 20th and 21st century book. Could you speak to other ways in which you think that some of these ideas that were circulating in the 19th century and that Rebouças was part of and contributed to, their relevance today?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. When you go back to that context of, let's say, first half of 19th century, I think that what he is dealing with is the construction, the building of the Brazilian state. So independence, but even more than that, is how after independence you can create a liberal state. So how, I mean, that's not part of him, but it's part of the discussion then, if that state can be an empire and can be liberal. And then, which is really his question, if that state could be liberal and also have slavery. So that discussion is a very typical 19th century, not just Brazilian, but when you think about the Americas, discussion, right? And then what I think that goes beyond, which is you just mentioned, is his discussion of civil rights connected to race. And he was seen as a threat because he was racialized, mainly in the 1830s. And what is really interesting, and I think we can see that even today, throughout the whole 20th century, but even today, is even though someone is like him, he was defending the order. He was a conservative man in that sense, but he was deeply, deeply, deeply anti-racist in our standards. And because of that, he was seen as a threat. And it's amazing to me, or it's sad, it's terrible, how you can see those ideas when even the conservative ones, when they are seen through racial lens, they are seen as a potential threat. So in his case, he really was, he made this huge effort not to be seen as someone of African ascendance. And of course, he was seen as someone of a Black person all his life. He fought against that. He got sad in the sense that he was never able to overcome that. but at the same time, that put him in a political side that it's hard for us now to understand, right? Because we tend not to like him because he is against the social movement. But that's precisely what I think that it's important to think, right? And then the other issue, which is now broken for the good, I think, in Brazil and in other places, it's how his behavior and his son's behavior too is connected to this idea of racial silence, which is something I didn't develop more in the book. That was part of my work since I published in Portuguese, and now it's very much with the works that I've been doing together with Abby Matos. This idea that to really understand the history of Brazil, I think, but the history of ideas about race and the behavior of different groups, we need to understand what racial silence means in Brazil, which is the opposite of racial democracy in the sense that we understand. I think that's something we need to explore. And just one more things about the social movements and how much he was against that is the fact that in the 1830s, if you really look what was happening here, was a set of civil wars. That we don't use that name, but that's really what it was. And those civil wars, which were in some ways could be progressive depending on how you look at them, they were really connected to the step back that the Regresso meant in the 1837 when this group of very, very conservative planters took over. And I think that to understand the coup of 2016 in Brazil, we really, really need to look at the 1837 context. It explains a lot. So just to put this in the past and present perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. When I read that, when I was reading about the Regresso, and about Rebouças moving through it, I thought of Brazil, but I also thought of the US in the sense of all of a sudden these ideas, these liberal ideas that Rebouças had been arguing and with at least some support prior were all of a sudden so out of place in this new kind of newly conservative context. And thinking about in that section where you talk about the Regresso and about kind of, I guess, Rebouças' downfall as a statesman and turn to being a lawyer, he argued that, well, generally he argued that race shouldn't really be taken into consideration at all. It seems like it was about property, it was about the condition of freedom, and those were the important pieces, and in fact seemed to kind of try to deflect arguments about race because they always worked against him. As you showed very, very clearly, he was always being accused of making these broad racial arguments that he wasn't actually making. So he wasn't arguing for freedom for everybody. He wasn't upholding that enslaved people should riot or resist or rebel. These weren't his principles, but people would say that he was defending those because he was a person of color. So, and the one time that he seemed to really actually bring in and say, no, I'm trying to remember the name. I don't want to mess it up here. That mulatto should have should be able to appear in, it was the court. Well, the one time he brought race into it turned everybody against him. The conservative turned against him, and also the mulattoes turned against him for not being a staunch enough supporter. So yeah, that was an interesting point, and one that also made me think of discussions of affirmative action, of quotas in Brazil, right? Of whether or not race is something that should even be in discussion in things that are obviously being structured by race. Right.
Would be
So,
totally opposed to the idea of affirmative action.
yeah. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Absolutely. I can hear his arguments, and that's because, and the reason I can hear them so easily is because they're actually in circulation by other people who also probably do not, that I know, that are anti-racist. So the ability to kind of move these arguments around in unexpected ways, but also in very persistent ways that follow into, I believe, these 20th and 21st century debates got to me. I'm going to try to throw out one more question before Christine stops me. And that is, one thing that I thought was interesting in reading this text is that it's a very masculine text. It's focused on Rebouças, and it's focused on the legal and political realm, which, you know, as it was very a masculine space, right? And yet the previous book that you had done on Liberata was the counter of that in a lot of ways. How was it different for you working through those two different books, those two different people, beyond that you were just in a different space in life and in your profession and your career? But how did it feel working with Rebouças in contrast to somebody like Liberata?
You know, it's another super interesting question, because I think that in some ways, as you just framed it, both those works are about gender a lot, but I wasn't thinking about that when I wrote Liberata, and I wasn't thinking about that when I wrote this book. But now I am. I'm working on with an African woman that was kidnapped in the north of Uruguay and taken to the south of Brazil in 1854. And this is very much a genderized approach to the topic. So it's interesting because those spaces then, they are very different. I think that Rebouças especially, his life is very much defined by who his mother was. But for the silence, he never talks about that. We don't know much about her. But yet his public figure, it's always masculine. We know nothing about his wife, and I'm actually doing some research on her. So we know nothing about her through him, right? And that separation of the public space of Rebouças and the private space of Liberata is very much what the historiography was doing until not long ago, on really thinking that even legal, but the domestic legal aspect of slavery was dominated by women, while the public discussion, especially in the more professional ways, was just taken by men. I think that now we can overcome this. This was an artificial shift, but we were really, that's how we were looking at those documents up to 20 years ago. And now we are looking in a different way. I think that we can see much more women crossing those lines and appearing in the public spaces, as well as the importance of some women too in the lives of men like Antônio Pereira Rebouças. So one of the things that I'm investigating, just to end this, is that it seems that Carolina, that's her name, Carolina Rebouças. It seems that Carolina Rebouças comes from a family of merchants in Bahia. that are connected to the slave trade. So I'm investigating that. So more soon on that.
Oh, how interesting. I did wonder about her because there's his mother, who obviously is important, and his wife, and then I think he had 2 daughters. Is that right?
Yeah, that, and I never found more information about them.
Interesting. Fascinating. I'm looking forward to learning more about your new project that you're working through too. Fantastic.
Thank you both for getting us started with such interesting observations, thinking about how we study history, how our interpretations change over time, some good advice about writing history, and I think some productive ideas to think about the resonance of this 19th century history in our present moment here in the UK and Brazil and elsewhere as well. So there's a lot more to discuss. We'd love to open it up for a few questions from others. If you want to, you can use the raise hand function, or you can type into the chat, either type a question into the chat or just type, I have a question, and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute yourself.
I think there is a traditional raise.
Right. We'll see who would like to be the first to ask a question. Stuart has one. Go. We need to unmute you.
I'm unmuting.
There you go.
Okay. So, what was his relation like with Luis Gama, who was another Black abolitionist who, as a lawyer, but was far more radical in a sense about abolitionism and about the whole question of slavery and private property. They're both usually put forward as representatives of the kind of Black participation in the abolitionist movement in Brazil. But there's a major street in São Paulo named for Rebouças, but is there a major street named for Luis Gama? So I'm interested about what their relationship was with each other in the movement, but also then about how Brazil has subsequently looked at these two positions within the abolitionist movement in Brazil.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Stuart. So Luis Gama, I don't think that Luis Gama and Antônio Pereira Rebouças, Rebouças, the father, that they have met actually in person, as Luis Gama was in São Paulo and Rebouças was in Rio then. And he was far more, Luis Gama was not just far more radical, but we now believe that he was the one who realized in legal ways that if the slave trade was prohibited, as it was in 1831, then everyone that entered the country, at least 700,000 enslaved Africans who entered in the country were illegally held as slaves. Then in the late 1860s, that means that there were no more legal slaves in Brazil. So he came up with this argument first, I believe, which was far, far, far more radical than what Antônio Pereira Rebouças did, which was an argument against slavery. It was an argument against the fact that if you deserve to be free, that's what Rebouças believed. If you deserve to be free, you are entitled to get freedom. But that for individuals, never, ever for big groups, never. So he was really opposing abolition. But I want to highlight that Rebouças, the father, he was a man of the first half of 19th century. And Luis Gama and André, they were men of the second half of 19th century. So, but even in that sense, Luis Gama was far more progressive in the 1870s, let's say, than André Rebouças, who wasn't really thinking until the 1880s, I believe, of total abolition without compensation and everything. So Luiz Gama was really a more radical, and that's much more radical. I think that there are two reasons why we know much more about André Rebouças than about Luiz Gama. One is that he died pretty young, Luiz Gama. So he wasn't alive when I think he died in 76, if I'm not wrong, or early in not far from that. So he didn't see the abolitionist movement really taking shape as it did in the 1880s, when it became even more radical than he was. So that's one small part of the answer. The big part of the answer is that André Rebouças and his brother, Antônio Pereira Rebouças Filho, they were known as the first Black engineers. And that's the reason why you get big avenues, tunnels, roads of his name, not because he was an abolitionist. So, and that's super interesting, I think, which is and why he was so praised then was because he was a monarchist. I think, I think that many of you know that when the emperor left after the Republic, the coup of the Republic in 1889, he left too. He went with them in their to Lisbon. So he was very attached to the royal family. He was the first Black engineer, and he was an abolitionist. So that's why he became such an important figure, a very close friend to the princess, as people say. So, and then there is a rediscovery of Luiz Gama now. I don't know if you're following, there has been a lot of new studies, especially about his articles in the papers, that really shows that probably in the 1860s and 70s, there was no one thinking about the abolition process as a legal process better than him. But the irony is, just to end this, the irony is that Luiz Gama admired Antônio Pereira Rebouças for just being who he was, but as an older man from another generation, not someone that he would discuss ideas with, but as someone that was kind of a model for him.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Thank you.
Other questions? You can either raise your hand or type something into the chat. Well, maybe I'll ask a question while we're waiting to see if we have other braver volunteers. Oh, here, we have one from Tom right here. So he'd like you to discuss some of the most relevant international models and ideas with which he engaged. And he's also interested in how Rebouças imagined the future, eventual abolition or permanent slavery.
Well, thank you. The international models, it's interesting that you can find those ideas both in his writings and in his library, which is this is not in this edition, I think, but it is in the Portuguese edition. You could see all his books in his library, so we could see what his models were. And he was a reader of the classic liberals. So he was really thinking about the discussion of Montesquieu, of especially the division of powers, but the main liberal ideas. And Benjamin Constant, which was a big name here in the 1820s, but really to think about the state. He would read the Portuguese legal writers, especially the ones about the civil code. which is kind of interesting because he doesn't really follow their ideas, which are very much connected to Catholic ideas, which he didn't follow. So those are his models. He was really thinking about the state and how to understand the state. Now your question about what the future would be, it is interesting because it was something that we didn't have time to discuss earlier, which was he was very against, very much opposed to the slave trade. But as a trade on enslaved people. He wasn't opposed to the immigration of Africans to work as in the British model, very much in the British model. Actually, I forgot to say that. He was paying a lot of attention of what was going on in Jamaica and in the British Caribbean. And he was he would defend this idea that Brazil shouldn't allow enslaved Africans to come as slaves, but as workers, as free workers. Free workers, as you know, in the 19th century definition of free workers. So, so now this is not in his words, it's what I think, that for him, the future of slavery was a slow ending of slavery to the ones, basically manumission for the ones who deserve to get freedom, who worked well enough, were able to save money and to pay for their freedom. And then the ending of the slave trade. So this is not a revolution at all. He wouldn't even think about it. I don't remember him really discussing and using the word abolition in that sense. I would say that he would defend the abolition, the ending of slavery through the ending of the slave trade. And then a very big defender of paid manumission, because you work, you get your money, and you pay for it. That shows you deserve. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to add anything there? Or Paulo, would you like to read your question, or shall I read it? All right, I'll go ahead and read it. Paulo's asked if Keila could say more about the collective memory of Rebouças in Brazil and whether it has any political purchase. Well, now I see Paulo's face.
No problem. You mean Rebouças the father, and Antonio Rebouças? It's Antonio, right?
Sorry, yes.
It's interesting because he's still very unknown as a public figure. And it's funny because in some ways in my book, people refer to Antonio as if he were André. So there is a you know, a confusion between both names. I'm saying that because he was forgotten, Antonio. And that's why I want to claim now that his life very much can tell the story of Brazilian independence. So him as a hero of independence up to 1837, up to when he loses. Because his idea of what Brazil could have been in the 1830s, it's basically what we could think now as, well, what could have happened if those more liberal ideas have won. But I'm saying that, Paulo, because I don't think that Rebouças, he didn't, I think that this happened to many Black intellectuals in the 19th century. They didn't last as heroes of the independence of anything else. Rebouças André, it's a very big name in the collective memory, and it's actually now being disputed by, you know, some of the Bolsonaristas who wants to claim that you can, you know, that's the good abolitionist because he was Black and monarchist. Of course, not really knowing anything about how radical his ideas were about land reform and, and education for all and everything. But Rebouças, the father, really is still nowadays just known as an important jurist and the father of André. So, like others, like Montezuma, for instance, Montezuma was the first minister of justice from 1835 to 37 or so, and it's the first president of the Institute of Brazilian Lawyers, and I talk about him in the book. He's also more or less of a forgotten figure. And maybe that's due to the conservative movement that took over after the late 1830s, early 1840s. But those men, they didn't survive the empire, let's say, in that sense, as symbols. As others did, some even more radical, like Frei Caneca, but white. So again, when race was in question, they were forgotten. They were silenced. I don't know if you say that, silenciados. They were silenced, I think.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I just wanted to make a comment on that, if that's okay. Just that, because there's something very sad in that, beyond the bigger picture of the silencing of Black intellectuals in the 19th century. There's something sad about that, because in the book, it comes across that he wants people to know how important he was in the independence wars. He wants people to know that he made a mark on the nation. Like, that's really important to him, and yet he feels that it's continually being forgotten or diminished, and so there's something very sad in that. He's right. It was essentially forgotten and diminished.
When you read his autobiography, the one that he was actually written by André, I don't know if he wrote first and then André copied, or if he was just telling the stories to André, but you can feel that in a very, very heavy way. He really was convinced that he was this very important figure for at least the independence of Bahia, which he probably have been, but he wasn't. He just wanted some recognition, and that was the case. He was a person desperate for recognition, and he wouldn't get that. And I think that he wouldn't get that because of the threat that his figure posed in political ways. And that's how you can explain why he shifted from, as you said, from a political career to a legal career as a lawyer, and how he was, becoming more and more a person that would be a specialist on civil law and slavery. He really lost. And that made, I think, and that's me making up, but when you read it, you can see how bitter he was. You can see that bitterness or the resentment of someone that worked for the country, for the empire, that defended the emperor, defended the social order, act against the Malays rebellion, against the Sabinada in 1837. So really defended the empire or the social order, never get any recognition. And in his reading, he never says that, but it's clear that he didn't get it because he was subject of racism. And that's the main irony, I think, of he was always seen as a Black man, that he was, in a way that he hated to be seen as. So yes, I mean, it's also a story, and that is very much, in a previous book by Leo Spitzer about the Rebouças family too. that's very much in his reading on how the stories of those families like the Rebouças families, are stories of big resentments that were created through racism.
Do you think those experiences with racism kind of tested his ideological principles later in his life? Do you see any evidence of that?
That's interesting. No, I mean, I would have to read that again to check. I don't think so. I mean, I think he was a truly liberal in the sense of liberal, someone who believes in property, and someone who believes in what he called talents and merits, talentos y virtudes, talents and virtues. So he in that sense, he was really a truly liberal, and you could see that through his legal work. But he never, I don't see, in any of his writings, anything about that.
Interesting. We have time for one or two more questions. Paulo? Yeah.
I'm happy to cede to someone else if anyone has a question, but if not,
Would you go ahead and ask if someone else wants to type into the chat? Please do.
I'm interested in if you could say something about your investment in biography as a style of historical writing, and I'd be interested to know what is the status of biographical writing in Brazilian historiography. Where does it rank as is it something that's accepted? Is it seen as a kind of public history facing type of genre? Yeah.
Well, that's also a great question. When I was writing the book, I took a course on history and biography. But it was basically on methodological approach to how can you see a person's life. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that I never, when I was writing, I couldn't do research in Bahia, which was crucial. So there's many more documents that people are finding about that were out of the book. And because of the fact that I shifted my subject pretty late, it was in my last year, I didn't have much time to do that research. And I'm saying that because that's probably one of the reasons I wasn't really thinking about a biography in the sense of, okay, I'm gonna find every single detail of his life. The question came before I found him. So this was really a discussion about slavery, civil rights, the state, the liberal state, and the law, and the making of the civil law. So it was really about how slavery, the problem of slavery to the law, to the Brazilian state. So I thought a little bit about that, but because that wasn't my intention, I didn't focus much, which is something that if I were going to, I am doing that, just going back to the archives to find more information, because I think that there's much more in the previous generation that explains a lot about his behavior later. So I'm more interested in biography now than I was then. And I think this is also part of what the Brazilian historiography, because that biographies are not big here as they are in the US and in the UK. Not at all. Not as part of a historiographical analysis, not as part of a public history kind of thing. They're becoming more, and you see more biographies, and there are some excellent excellent books on history, like Chica da Silva's book, by Júnior Furtado, which was translated into English. Or and there is a 3-volume on Getúlio Vargas by an amateur historian. So there's more and more, but I would say much more on the books for the public audience. Even though there is one for those of you who read Portuguese, there is a biography on Duque de Caxias for 19th century by Adriana Barreto, which is amazing in the sense of how to tell a story of a person's life and think about the wider context. But right now, I think that here, as well as in other places, in the US and the UK, there is a discussion about a life, how you were going to write about the life of a person that you probably never met and you probably don't have enough documents. So this is growing, and especially in the public history side. What is also growing, and I myself am very interested in that, is the connections of people that will never be subject of biographies, so common, regular people. And how can you tell this, how can you talk about the big context through, it's very much microhistory question, but through the lives of these persons, but not just because their life is a symbol of something that happened, but because what they did had an impact of the bigger context. So it's really about maybe causes and impacts of your actions into the big context. And I think that there's lots of people interested in that. I'm very much interested on that now. And having a very, very hard time trying to write something that will show both the small picture and the big picture at the same time.
I'm conscious of the time here, but we have one more very interesting question in the chat, which I will just pose to you to give an abbreviated answer. Yari Perez Marin has asked about the connection between the Brazilian context for this period and debates taking place in other slave societies with other Black intellectuals. Do you have any kind of brief thoughts on that question?
It is interesting. Thanks for the question. I think that it is interesting because I think it resonates a lot of other Latin American slave societies. And I would be very cautious on making the comparison with the US. Just wondering what you think about that. Just because the ways in which Black intellectuals like him could have a public presence was very different in, I think, places in Latin America than in the US. And it's interesting because in the foreword that Barbara Weinstein wrote, she was exactly making this point of just calling the attention to Douglas' case, but not because he was similar to Douglas, but because he was different than Douglas. And maybe the short answer is race, is how you could be a free man of African descent in Brazil and have a place, at least in the first half of 19th century, that it could not have after that. In the recent book by Alejandro de la Fuente and Ariela Gross, when they compared places in the US, it's Louisiana, Virginia, and the third, and Cuba, of course. So they make this point, which is not exactly the fact that there is slavery, but how race is seen, that defines that category of free men, but especially free intellectuals in a different way. That's trying to give the short answer, but I think it's a very, very interesting question, especially for that context of the 1820s and 1830s.